The silk of the dress felt like a second skin, a deep, bruised purple that clung to the curve of her hips and the swell of her breasts. Eleanor stood before the gilt-edged mirror in their bedroom, a stranger in her own reflection. The dress was a statement, a silent rebellion she knew only she would understand. It was sleeveless, exposing the soft, pale skin of her arms, a feature she knew he despised as much as he despised the rest of her. She had bought it for tonight, for him, a final, futile gesture. From the window, she saw the headlights of his sedan slice through the manicured darkness of the estate's long driveway. The engine cut, and the ensuing silence was heavier than the engine's rumble had been. She did not need to see him to know the precise, economical way he would move. But she watched anyway. She watched as Marco Santoro, her husband, the undisputed king of the city's shadows, walked around the car. He did not come to the house. He opened the passenger door. A slender leg emerged first, wrapped in shimmering gold. Then the rest of her, Isabel, a girl of 20, all sharp angles and effortless grace, poured out of the car like spilled champagne. Her laughter, a sound like tiny bells, carried on the cool night air. Marco's hand rested on the small of her back, a gesture of possession so casual, so public, it was a physical blow. He never touched Eleanor like that. He never touched her at all. This was the ritual. For every gala, every fundraiser, every public display of power, Marco had a wife he kept locked away in this gilded cage, and he had a woman he wore on his arm like a prize. Eleanor was the former. Isabel was the latter. Eleanor had been a political marriage, a binding of her late father's legitimate influence to the Santoro family's darker enterprises. She was a contract signed in a church, and once the ink was dry, she had been filed away. She had accepted this. She had learned to live in the quiet spaces, in her library with her rare books, their brittle pages a comfort. But acceptance had curdled into a slow-burning acid in her gut. Tonight, the acid was threatening to burn through. She had thought, foolishly, that this one night, the anniversary of the agreement that had made her his wife, he might make a different choice. He had not. He would take Isabel to the Callaway fundraiser, and Eleanor would remain here, a ghost in a purple dress. The humiliation was a familiar weight, but tonight it felt heavier, suffocating. Later, long after the sound of their departure had faded, Eleanor descended the sweeping staircase. The house was silent, staffed by people paid to be invisible. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. The house felt vast and empty, a mausoleum for a life she was not living. She found herself drifting into his study, a room she rarely entered. It smelled of him, a clean, sharp scent of cedarwood and cold ambition. A laptop was open on his massive mahogany desk. It was unlike him to be so careless. Her gaze fell upon the screen. It was a security feed, live from the Callaway Hotel ballroom. And there he was, Marco, a statue carved from onyx in his tailored tuxedo, stood talking to another man. Isabel was at his side, radiant, a perfect accessory. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could hear their voices, tinny through the laptop speakers. She watched, a voyeur to her own life, as Marco moved through the crowd, a predator in his natural habitat. She was about to turn away, to retreat to her quiet world of paper and ink, when a new figure entered the frame. An older man, Lorenzo Moretti, the head of the only family in the city that did not bend to Marco's will. He bypassed Marco completely and approached a city councilman Marco had been cultivating for months. Moretti said something, his back to the camera, and the councilman's face paled. The councilman then made his excuses and walked away from Marco's circle, avoiding his eyes. Eleanor watched, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. A few minutes later, another of Marco's key business associates was pulled aside by one of Moretti's men. The pattern was clear. Moretti was poisoning the well, isolating Marco in a room full of people. Then she saw it. Moretti finally approached Marco. He smiled, a cold, reptilian thing. Santoro, his voice crackled through the speaker. A beautiful girl. But she is not your wife, it was not a question. Some of us old-timers, we remember your father-in-law, a man of his word, a man who understood that a family is built on foundations, not decorations. He gestured vaguely toward Isabel. A man who cannot honor his own house cannot be trusted to honor a deal. The world tilted on its axis. Eleanor had always believed her public erasure was a personal cruelty, a simple, brutal preference for a different kind of woman. She had thought it was about her body, her quiet nature, her inability to glitter in the way Isabel did. But it was not. It was a political miscalculation. In Marco's world, a wife was a symbol of stability, a testament to a man's control over his own domain. By hiding her, by replacing her with a mistress, he was not projecting power. He was telegraphing instability. He was showing the world that his own house was in disorder. And his enemies, like Lorenzo Moretti, were using it against him. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over her. Her humiliation was not just a private shame. It was a weapon her husband's enemies were wielding against him. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. The woman in the purple dress was no longer a ghost. She was a liability. Or, perhaps, she was an asset he had tragically undervalued. She had spent years being invisible. It was time to see what would happen if she disappeared completely. The decision, once made, settled in her bones with the weight of absolute certainty. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor moved through her days with a new, quiet purpose. Her grief, the dull ache of her sham marriage, was replaced by the clean, sharp focus of a plan. She was a book restorer by trade, a profession that had taught her patience, precision, and the art of working unseen. She applied those skills to dismantling her life. She began in her library, her sanctuary. She had a small but valuable collection of first editions, acquired long before she became Mrs. Santoro. Through a trusted dealer in London, a man she knew only through encrypted emails, she began to sell them off, one by one. The money was wired to a new account under her maiden name, an account she opened using a shell corporation her father had set up for her years ago as a tax shelter. It felt like a message from the grave, a final gift from the man who had inadvertently placed her in this cage. Marco was home more often. The fallout from the Callaway event was subtle but pervasive. A shipping contract lost, a zoning permit unexpectedly delayed. He moved through the house like a storm cloud, his silence more menacing than any shouting. He started noticing her. Before, she had been part of the furniture. Now, his dark eyes would follow her as she moved from room to room. He saw her packing a small crate of books, and his voice, low and dangerous, stopped her cold. "Where are those going?" "To be restored," she lied smoothly, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. "A client in Boston." He said nothing, but his gaze lingered, heavy with a suspicion he could not yet name. One evening, they found themselves alone at the cavernous dining table, a rare occurrence. The staff served the meal and vanished. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "Moretti is making a move," he said suddenly, not looking at her. He was speaking to himself as much as to her. "He thinks I'm weak." Eleanor placed her fork down, her hand perfectly steady. "Are you?" His head snapped up. His eyes, the color of burnt coffee, pinned her to her seat. It was the first time she had ever challenged him, even obliquely. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before the mask of cold control slammed back into place. "Loyalty is the only currency in my world, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "My brother taught me that. He sold our father out to the Morettis for a pretty face and a pocketful of promises. I was the one who had to clean it up." He picked up his wine glass, his knuckles white. "Trust is a thing you earn once. You don't get a second chance." He was telling her a story about his brother, but he was also telling her about them. He could not trust her, could not let her in, because he saw his brother's betrayal in every shadow. He saw it in her quietness, her otherness. He had married her for duty, and that was the only box she was permitted to occupy. The admission, chilling as it was, did not stir her pity. It only hardened her resolve. His wounds were his own. She would not be a casualty of a war that had ended before she ever met him. Her chance to act came sooner than she expected. Through one of her father's old law firm contacts, a man who still sent her a Christmas card every year out of respect for his deceased mentor, she heard a whisper. Moretti was planning to use a federal mole to trigger a surprise audit of Santoro's shipping company, the most legitimate and profitable of his public-facing businesses. The audit was designed to freeze his assets, to cripple him. The information was a live grenade in her hands. She could let it explode. She could walk away from the wreckage, free. It was what she wanted. But a clean escape required stability. If Marco's empire collapsed violently, the ensuing chaos would trap everyone, including her. A wounded wolf is most dangerous. She needed him stable, confident, and distracted, just for a little while longer. She made a choice, not for him, for her. That night, she typed a single, anonymous message from a burner email address. Federal Audit, Pier 12. Your accountant is the mole. She sent it to Marco's second-in-command, a man whose loyalty was unquestioned. She closed the laptop, her heart pounding. She had just interfered deliberately in his world. The next evening, he found her in her workshop. The room smelled of old leather and sizing glue. Delicate tools were laid out on her workbench with surgical precision. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching her. The usual storm of his presence was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. The books for Boston, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't look up from the medieval manuscript she was painstakingly repairing. Yes. He moved into the room, his footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. He stopped beside her workbench, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked down at her hands, at the delicate way she handled a needle-thin brush. My people spent all day trying to trace an email, he said, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. A ghost. But the ghost knew something only a handful of people could have known. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She kept her eyes fixed on the illuminated letter on the page before her. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently run a finger along the spine of a leather-bound volume on her desk. The gesture was so out of character, so lacking in his usual coiled violence, that it unnerved her more than any threat could have. You have your father's mind, he stated, a simple fact. He knew where all the bodies were buried because he helped bury them. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his. The air between them crackled. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew the information had come from her. He was not angry. He was intrigued, and that was far more dangerous. Eleanor, he said, and her name sounded different. He had always said it like a label, a title. Now it was a question weighted with a meaning she couldn't decipher. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. The woman who restored broken things, the woman who moved in silence, the woman who had just saved him. Her careful plan for a quiet escape had just been shattered. By helping him, she had made herself visible. And in Marco Santoro's world, to be seen was to be owned. He would not let her go now. He would watch her, cage her more tightly than ever, convinced she was a strategic asset he had to control. Her path to freedom had just become a warpath. The shift was immediate. The illusion of freedom she had within the estate was gone. A man named Luca, one of Marco's most trusted soldiers, was assigned to her. The official reason was her safety, a precaution against Moretti's retaliation. But Eleanor knew the truth. Luca was not a bodyguard. He was a warden. His shadow clung to her. A trip to her art supplier, a visit to the city archives. Every movement was monitored, reported. The gilded cage now had visible bars. Her escape plan, once so clear, was now a tangled mess. Her window of opportunity was closing. Marco's newfound attention was a suffocating blanket. He sought her out, joining her for coffee in the mornings, appearing in her workshop at night. He asked questions about her work, about her father, about her life before him. He was studying her, trying to understand the puzzle piece that suddenly refused to fit in its designated box. This proximity was a new kind of torture, more intimate and unsettling than his previous neglect. The Morettis, enraged by their foiled plan, grew bold. They knew the leak had to have come from inside Marco's circle, and their suspicion fell on the wife he never showed, the daughter of a man known for his intricate web of information. She was the unknown variable, and they decided to remove her from the board. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. Luca was driving her back from a consultation at the university library. A black SUV slammed into their car, forcing them into a deserted industrial side street. Two men emerged before Luca could even draw his weapon. The world dissolved into a cacophony of shouting and shattering glass. Luca was a professional, moving with brutal efficiency, but he was outnumbered. Eleanor didn't scream. Her mind, honed by years of meticulous work, went cold and clear. While one man engaged Luca, the other wrenched her door open. A hand clamped down on her arm, hard enough to bruise. He was pulling her out, into the rain, into the violence. This was it. This was how her quiet life ended. Then, another car, Marco's sedan, screeched around the corner, appearing as if from nowhere. He must have been following them. The paranoia that made him a tyrant also made him a terrifyingly effective protector. Marco emerged from the car not with rage, but with a chilling, lethal calm. The ensuing fight was not a brawl. It was a piece of brutal choreography. He moved through the violence like it was his native language. Shots were fired, echoing in the narrow street. Marco shoved Eleanor behind him, his body a solid wall shielding her from the chaos. His focus was absolute, his movements precise. In the midst of it all, Eleanor saw her chance. Luca was down, clutching a bleeding arm. Marco was disarming one attacker. The other, the one who had grabbed her, was on the ground, wounded but reaching for a dropped pistol. He was going to shoot Marco in the back. There was no time to think. Her workshop, her sanctuary, was a place of delicate tools, but also heavy equipment. To her right, on the sidewalk, was a stack of discarded metal pallets from a warehouse. Acting on pure, unadulterated instinct, she shoved the top one with all her might. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it moved. It toppled over with a deafening clang, crashing down on the attacker's arm, pinning him to the wet pavement. His scream was swallowed by the rain. Silence descended. The remaining Moretti man was gone. Luca was groaning but alive, and Marco was standing over the man Eleanor had trapped, his chest heaving. He turned slowly, his eyes finding hers. He saw her, drenched and trembling, but standing her ground. He saw what she had done. She hadn't just been a victim. She had acted. She had crossed a line. Back in the suffocating silence of the house, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a raw, vibrating tension in its wake. Marco dismissed the household staff with a single, sharp gesture. He led her into the study, the scent of rain and gunpowder clinging to them both. He walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, his hands rock steady. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed, a jolt of electricity in the cold room. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze stripping away every layer of her composure. He walked over to her, cornering her against the massive desk. He gently took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up to the light, examining her as if searching for cracks. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, a gravelly sound that was more intimate than a touch. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. His thumb brushed against her lower lip. "You should have screamed," he murmured. "Most people would have." "I'm not most people," she managed to whisper. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "No," he agreed. "You are not." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the cedar and the danger on his skin. The world narrowed to the space between them. "You should have run when you had the chance, Eleanor." He breathed, the words a confession against her skin. "Before all this, before I saw you, His grip on her chin tightened almost imperceptibly. "Now I can't let you." It was not a threat. It was a statement of absolute fact. A vow. He was claiming her, not as a wife in name, but as a part of himself he could no longer afford to lose. And in the terrifying, charged silence of that room, she did not pull away. Her silence was its own confession. She believed this moment, this shared violence and brutal honesty, had finally forged a real connection between them, a bond of survival. But when she woke the next morning, the space beside her in the bed was cold. On the chair by her door sat a small, packed suitcase. On top of it was a plane ticket to a private island in the Caribbean, a passport with a new name, and a folder containing a bank transfer confirmation for a sum of money that made her feel dizzy. He was sending her away. After everything, after his confession, his solution was to exile her. He thought he was protecting her, putting her on a shelf where she couldn't be broken. But to her, it was the ultimate rejection. He was still choosing to keep her out of his life. He was not her partner. He was her keeper, and he had decided her cage needed to be moved to a safer location. The bond she thought they had forged was just another set of chains, and he was the one holding the key. She stared at the ticket, the name on it, a stranger's name, a brand of ownership. He had not asked her. He had decided. This was not protection. It was erasure. He was sending his problem away so he could fight his war alone. The cold fury that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. He did not get to decide for her. Not anymore. She left the bag where it was. She walked past the ticket and the money as if they were trash on the sidewalk. She went to her workshop, her mind a razor-sharp instrument. He thought she was a fragile book that needed to be stored in a climate-controlled vault. He had forgotten that she was the one who knew how to read the text, how to see the secrets hidden in the binding. She knew Marco was walking into a trap. Sending her away was his way of clearing the board before the final, bloody checkmate. The betrayal by his brother had left a rot in the family, a faction loyal to the old ways, a faction that believed Marco's modern tactics and his strange, unseen wife were a weakness. They were working with the Morettas. The sit-down planned for that night wasn't for peace. It was for his execution. Eleanor wouldn't go to the meeting. She wouldn't try to warn him. His pride would never allow him to listen to her. She had to use the rules of his own world, a world she now understood with chilling clarity. She made one phone call, to the same contact from her father's firm. She didn't ask for gossip this time. She asked for a specific file from the archives, a file detailing the original land purchase for a Santoro warehouse, a deal brokered by her father 30 years ago, a deal co-signed by Marco's uncle, the man now leading the seditious faction within the family. The file arrived an hour later, and there it was, tucked into the legal jargon. A hidden clause, a side deal her father had documented meticulously, proving that Marco's uncle had been skimming from the family for decades, long before Marco took over. It was proof of the original sin, the root of the betrayal. She didn't take the file to Marco. She took it to the one man even Marco Santoro had to respect, Antonio Romano, the retired, near-legendary head of the commission. He lived in a quiet brownstone in Brooklyn, a king in self-imposed exile. He had been a great friend of her father's. She was granted an audience. She walked into his dimly lit study, the air thick with the smell of old cigars and power. She placed the file on his desk. "My husband is walking into a meeting with the Morettas tonight," she said, her voice even and calm. "His uncle Pietro will be at his side. I believe this file will be of interest to you, as a matter of family stability." She did not accuse. She did not plead. She presented the evidence and trusted the old man's instincts. She was not asking him to save her husband. She was asking him to protect the institution he had built, an institution Pietro's treachery threatened to collapse. Romano opened the file. He read for a long time, his face impassive. Finally, he looked up at her, his old eyes sharp and appraising. He saw not the frightened wife, but the daughter of his old friend, a woman with a spine of steel. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Go home, Mrs. Santoro. This matter will be handled. Eleanor returned to the house. The silence was absolute. She waited. She did not pace. She went to her workshop and picked up the medieval manuscript. Her hands were steady as she resumed her work, mending a tear on a page that had survived centuries. She was saving something beautiful from falling apart. Hours later, she heard his car. Not the screech of a desperate arrival, but the quiet crunch of gravel under tires. She heard the front door open and close. Footsteps, heavy and weary, approached her workshop. Marco stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was stained with a small, dark blossom of blood on the sleeve, not his own. His face was pale, exhaustion carved into every line. The cold mask was gone, shattered. In its place was a raw, naked understanding. He walked into the room, not with the predatory grace of a king, but with the measured tread of a man who had just walked through fire and found his way home. He did not say thank you. He did not ask how she knew. He simply walked to her workbench and looked down at the delicate, precise work of her hands. He picked up one of her tools, a sharp, slender scalpel, and held it in his hand, feeling its dangerous weight. "You saved the family," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. Eleanor did not look up from the page. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "No," she said, "I saved my husband." A long silence followed. It was not empty. It was filled with everything they had never said, with the violence of the night, and with the brutal, undeniable truth of what she had just done. She had not only saved his life. She had solidified his power, purged the rot from his family, and proven herself to be more ruthless and intelligent than any of his soldiers. He did not ask her to stay. He did not need to. He pulled up a simple wooden stool from the corner of the room and sat across the workbench from her. He set the scalpel down gently. Then he simply watched her work, her steady hands meticulously mending the fragile page. The world outside, with its sirens and its ghosts, faded away. There was only the quiet scratch of her tools, the scent of old paper, and the weight of his presence. He was finally seeing his wife not as a contract or a liability, but as the architect of his survival. The queen who had saved her king. He was home, and she was no longer a prisoner in his house, but the foundation upon which it was built.